Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on the state of the Malasan Empire. And today we're here to finish up Book 2, The Eternal Return of, the Return of the Crimson Guard. That's chapters 5 and 6, which I read last night and this morning, and I hope I'll remember enough for me to talk about. And yeah, I guess that means Book 3 tomorrow and Friday. If all of that works out, Stone Wielder on Monday. Possibly. Maybe. We'll see. Anyway, let's get this started, shall we? Cheers. It's noon. So, chapter 5 is the longest one in the entire book, I think. And there's a lot going on there that we kind of need to figure out how to sort through and see where all of that is going. Now, of course, the first bit there first part is the travel to Jakuruku and what happens at the Dolmens and the death of Eriko and another another appearance of everyone's favorite High King, Calor. And the possibly failed attempt to free Prince Kaaz. And we'll see where all of that will lead in the near-ish future. What can we say about all of that? They go there, they find the dolmens, which may or may not be, be a lot of things. And one thing that I find fascinating is when they come to the dolmens and talk about the dolmens, it's like, yeah, they can be used to measure time. They could also be for rituals, also for burials, prisons, and whatnot. And what I appreciate about that is that, with the stuff that we have, like places like Stonehenge and all these, I guess they're Neolithic. I'm not good with times. I'm not an archaeologist. These things, we don't have writing, so we don't know who built that shit, and we don't know what it was used for. So as a good archaeologist, you usually say probably for ritualistic purposes, and because you have all these different different usages that we can find examples for. Were there people killed there? Possibly. Were people just buried there? Possibly. Was it used for something else? Who knows? So the fact that that on Jakuruku, even people who kind of should know don't know, just made me very happy in a very petty way. So I appreciated that. Well, apart from that, it seems to be a failure. They go there, they dig, they find someone, they find a corpse who is either Prince Kaz dead or someone else buried there. Who knows? And that Calor shows up. This is at the point where Calor is still, hanging out with the crippled god. And so we can see where this is in regards to the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because shortly before that we also have a scene where Kyle dreams and suddenly finds himself in a certain tent of a certain coughing figure and gets then dragged out by someone who may be Ardata or someone else. Who knows? But the point there is that this is still at the time where the crippled god is trying to recruit people, and Kellor is still working for him as maybe King in Chains, or maybe not, who knows, which helps him show up to attack Eriko and kill Eriko, because Eriko is not defending himself. And we kind of learned that was like an ongoing thing of Kalors who swore to kill every single Fel Akai. And now, why is this interesting all in all? I think the interesting bit here is about acceptance of fate, in a way. and how that can be defiance, because in, not fighting Calor, it he makes it so much less satisfying for Calor. I mean, we know at this point Calor, well, not in this book, but in general, we know that Calor is the kind of person who um, needs some kind of challenge or whatever to keep him going, because he's been there forever and it sucks. So killing the last Thal Akai without it being any point of climax or anything of any significance, um, makes it so much less meaningful for Calor and so much more meaningful for Eriko. Yeah. We also see here that in some situations it is so much more difficult for people around someone who dies to deal with the death than it is for the person accepting that death. We see that obviously with Kyle and Traveler and the way they blame each other for all kinds of things. And then Dassam goes and attacks Kalor and almost kills him, but he then, gets thrown away by everyone's favorite crippled god, that being the crippled god. Um, there's only one. And then they leave, taking with them one person from Gris. Now, this is kind of probably interesting to know, but yeah, they take Jan, or whatever his name is, with them, who was shipwrecked at the Dolmens, and they leave and run into Shadow Throne, which is, always cool to see scenes where we actually get Cam Aslamont right about Shadow Throne. Turns out he's still as completely crazy as he is in the Malazan Book of the Fallen parts, when he's written by Steven Erikson. So no more clarifications here. We get the usual antics of Shadow Throne and this is cool. So we know this is Esselmann's. This is Esselmann's Shadow Throne. Is when we also get the Nacht, the guy that was called Demon in Dance's Lament, doing ridiculous stuff around him, which only, well, not only, but mostly serves for to separate Traveler, Dassam from Kyle and company, and Kyle and company then walk off into wherever it will be. And Dassam, we assume, takes a boat, this one boat, to end up on a shoreline in Gedabakis, just in time to show up for Toll the Hounds. Or so I assume. Yeah, the interesting bit here obviously also is the religion thing, because, and this is something that I find fascinating. That kind of confused me. So when they're in Shadowhold, talking and so forth, Kyle's sword, the Tolwar with the wind signs, that he was always connecting to, Father Wind, the founder of his tribes and all of that, turns out to be the home of none other than everyone's favorite arrogant Tist Leosan, Osurg. And now I have a question that I kind of... Will that ever be explained? I doubt it. Why does Osurg here in this book have tusks? Is Osurg also half Jughood? Anyone know anything about that? I mean, we don't know who Osurg's mother is, right? We never find out in Corcanus. But I always thought he was Tist Leosan, and now he comes across as like this giant with tusks and whatnot. Which is interesting. Just saying. But anyway, Osurg is freed and gives Kyle his own sword, which I guess we'll learn about more about later on. But the interesting discussion here is, and that's something that I found fascinating before, is we learn a lot especially in Kyle's story, because it is that sort of chosen one, carrying a magic sword, making his way in the wild world and whatnot, storyline. But the interesting bit here is that all that all that stuff, all the visions, all the ideas about the gods, the father, the founder of his tribe, all of that gets kind of pulled out under him when Osirk turns up and says like, well, I'm not the founder of your tribe. I'm not Father Wind. I'm just like super powerful, and your stupid tribe just took those old symbols and made their worship out of it, and then just walks away. Which I think is important to look at because it shows the way that the Malazan world deals with religions, with beliefs, and the way they exist. It's like there are powerful beings, and people ascribe meaning to powers, the way the world works, and out of that, ritual, myth, and so forth are created by people. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no power in there, because obviously there is that fundamental connection between powerful beings that we spoke about earlier when Kyle is talking to, God, I forgot the name of the mage. Anyway, that mage of the Crimson Guard, when they're talking about how that Warren thing works, and the idea that there are powerful beings and that practitioners of Warrens or priests, which are technically the same thing, I guess, have some connection, and power is interchanged, and it should go in both ways. It can also go only in one way, which I guess is sort of where we find how religion can be more powerful than it is in, or has been for a long time, in our world. Now, that obviously that fundamental nature of religion, where you exchange stuff with the deity of choice, is something that we find a lot of in ancient religions. We spoke about that. I spoke about that before. So that kind of makes sense. And well, in our world, it turns out that, making all those deals with gods rarely actually got you the results that you bargained for, because maybe those gods don't exist, or don't exist in the way that we think. So those religions kind of lost their power. But now that you have, like, and this is, I feel, the fundamental thing that all fantasy worlds, and especially fantasy role playing, or based on role playing worlds, kind of have to deal with. The point that priests actually have power from the gods. So that general issue that faith, religious faith in our world, has, the idea that faith is always different from knowledge. So we don't know that God exists, we believe. But if, your priest can throw bolts of lightning granted with the power granted to him by that God, that fundamentally shifts and changes, because suddenly we know that God exists. We still have to discuss what kind of being that God is, what they are, what they want from us, and so forth. That's a different discussion that we still need to have. But the fundamental idea of faith falls apart. It becomes more a question of interpreting signs, knowledge, and whatnot. So we have that way that it works in the Malazan world, but sometimes it also doesn't, because you have someone who truly believes and doesn't understand that relationship, and then when their god shows up and says, yeah, you know what, I'm not your god, I'm just very powerful, and you ignorant barbarians started believing and worshipping me, fuck that, and walks away, then, we'll see where that will leave Kyle, because I guess it's kind of his duty to go home to his people and tell them that, Father Wind doesn't exist. He's just an arrogant, tusked bastard. Until his tusks get retconned or something. I don't know. But yeah. We, that I feel is one of those moments where we get a bit more insight into how religion works in the Malazan world, because we rarely get that. It's like you have priests and you have all the hierarchies of priests and whatnot, and some of those priests are just priests, and some of them are also spellcasters. But we always assume that. Oh, well, we not always assume, but we rarely get like an insight on how the Malazan world builds religion, which in this case is it's a world created by anthropologists and archaeologists. They have a different outlook on that than say theologians would have. So yeah, they look at how faith accrues to events or powerful entities, and how that will then build a structure or less structured way of like a accumulation of stories, myths, and whatnot. That's how religion works from a anthropological point of view. So we see that fairly explicitly here, which is pretty cool. Anyway, that's kind of where we leave Kyle for now, and then we return to all the other stuff that's going on. There's a bunch of things going on here. We need to talk about the first appearance of Rylanderus and what happens then. There's several things going on. One of them, obviously, that we need to look at is the idea of using power that goes beyond control. You could probably use it as a metaphor for nuclear weaponry if you want. The idea that you unleash something, and then once you have unleashed it, you realize its full potential, its full scope of violence. Only in this case, it also turns against the wielders. Wielding is a bit of a strong term when we talk about something like Rylanderus. It's more like you let it loose, and then you hope it will hurt your enemies more than it will hurt you. But we see that clearly in Hang when you look at how the whole thing keeps on moving there once they blow up. That's the other side of it, is like, yeah, well, if they try to destroy us, we're gonna take them down with us, which is what happens when Chas and Tok blow the other gate and let Rylanderus in almost into the next round of the city of Hang. I still find the idea of Rylanderus a very interesting one. I wish we'd have more input on that. Maybe we're gonna talk about it at a different point. But the idea of having a monster, it's sort of what you might see in your Greek myths, the kind of monster that your Heracles goes out to slaughter. Those beings that are extremely powerful and whose only function is to maraud and be a pain in the ass forever and ever and ever. I guess dragons fall under the same kind of thing. But the interesting part there is, for me, is like when you look at mythology, you never question their motives. It's like the whatever lion it was, or the boar, or whatever those animals that Heracles goes and slaughters. I think or King Arthur is slaughtering that one other big boar. You have those animals. You never question their motives. Like why does that extremely powerful animal hang out here and terrorize a city? What do they have? Why do they do that? What's in it for them? That's a question that you never really ask in mythology. Now, over time, we've started to assign motives. Dragons are wicked, and they want to collect treasure and virgins for whatever reason, and so forth. So they get some sort of motives, and then over time, and in the recent history, when you look at your Tolkien, I guess Smaug is one of the big steps in how we define or how we view dragons, because it takes a lot of those folktale versions of dragon characteristics and mythological aspects of dragon characteristics, and through the way it is written in The Hobbit, turns it into the archetypal dragon who's greedy, self-satisfied, highly intelligent, and whatnot. And that's sort of what we take from there. But with Rylanderus as the man jackal, first of all, it's not a lion, it's not a wolf, it's not, one of those very typically European-based monsters. It's a jackal, which is makes kind of sense when you look at the prairie or whatever, the steppes that it kind of lives on. So that all makes sense, but it gives it a bit of a twist already. And then the question is like, what's in it for Rylanderus? What's Rylanderus' motivation? He just likes to run around on the steppe and kill things and eat them. Is he an animal? But we know he's more than just an animal. There's sentience in there, but what does that sentience want? And that brings us to that other side of gods, because we have those gods, those animal gods in the Malazan universe. We have his brother Trake, or Treach, or whatever you want to call him. We have Fener, the boar. We have Tuck and Fenderay, the wolf gods. And I feel the interesting bit here is how that shows us how religion, once again, in the Malazan world works, which is like people are drawn to power and powerful animals. Like, that's something that we find from our world when you have all these ideas. Like, you worship a lion because he seems super powerful, or at least showy. You worship the wolf for having these like characteristics that we admire, and in all kinds of ways. So we worship them, and then suddenly you have that manifestation of that, and you suddenly have the boar of war, which is, I mean, yeah, a a boar is a perfect example for a god of war. I wonder why we don't have more of those in our world, because holy shit, those beasts are fierce. Um, anyway, and the question then is Rylanderus also a god of war, or close to a god of war, and thus the idea that he just slaughters indiscriminately is part of his role as a god of war, because war slaughters indiscriminately, it kills indiscriminately. It's not just a weapon, it's something that kills on both sides. And is that sort of what we see here, or is Rylander just simply insane? Which is kind of hard to say, but I find it interesting to look at Rylanderus and figure out what the fuck is going on there. It's like, why is he there? Why is he doing that? And since we kind of know that he is a soul taken, and a divers, because we meet him again, and this is something that I still need to figure out, because Rylanderus makes so little sense, because we meet Rylanderus in Deadhouse Gates, right? He's running around in Deadhouse Gates, while still being imprisoned in Li Hang at the same time, or so we think. So how can he be there and be on the other side as well? Anyway, it's a mystery, and more Rylanderus knowledge would certainly help me come to peace with myself. So I don't know. What else? But yes, we see how that weapon turns against everyone, and is thus a symbol for war that will take indiscriminately from all sides, not caring for justice or injustice or what have you. What else is important there? We see the Canis show up again. It's important that the Canis show up, because we'll see more of them later on. The Canis show up and wait for whoever wins. The Crimson Guard is there. Like, everything once again revolves about Li Hang, and we're getting ready for the big battle, the big show off between the Talians and the others. But on the other side, we also see, and this is, we're going to once again come back to religion, and how religion then turns into power, with Imhotep and the shamans of the Seti, and how that works. So, because once again their god is back, their like tribal nature is becoming a like the spiritualistic side, the shamanistic side of the Seti takes over again. And I guess that's sort of what we can understand here, is like what Kellenvad and Tok the Elder and all those people did was support the practical, everyday, secular side of the Seti, dealing with and it's always explained that with that talk is mostly dealing with the leaders of those warrior societies. I unfortunately forgot the name of those. That's a title for them. Anyway, he always treats with them. It's like if the the big god of the city is locked up somewhere and they have no access to it, it's obviously the leaders of secular power that are in control, and their motives are different, their ambitions are different. So that gave the Malazans some kind of leverage over or a common ground with the Seti to work together and do what the Malazans did to the Seti with the Seti and so forth. But now that that spiritual side is in ascendance again, the Malazans don't have that leverage anymore, and we see the result of that first in the arrogance of those leaders like Imotan, and then in the spectacular abandoning of the alliance, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Because it's time to talk about the big battle. Now, I've said it before, Cam Asselmont is a master of battle descriptions. Moving around between like a larger overview of how battle works or progresses down to the small moments. And what he does here, and I really appreciate, he does the whole thing with Nate. Now, Nate is always that corrupt military dude who doesn't take things seriously and thinks, because he's a peacetime soldier basically. Now he's in that situation, he's in there against his will, he doesn't like it and whatnot. He gets his name from Sergeant Braventooth, which is cool. And then in that situation he takes command and becomes a very successful soldier. He suddenly learns about responsibility once he has those kids from Unta with him and all of that. And that through line in its own is incredible, because if you look at it, just the story of Nate, then Corporal Jumpy, would make a complete novel for some people, right? You can take that whole story of him being that Coast Guard and being press ganged in there, finally finding his, spine, his responsibilities, learning about responsibilities, then tragically, mourning the death of Honeyboy and Hans, and finally facing off against Rylanderis. That would make for a pretty good novel or short story for just in itself. And here it's just like one small aspect of that great tapestry of a novel, in that even greater tapestry of the Malazan history. So that is just fascinating to look at. It obviously is just also written in a really gripping, adrenaline rushing way, which, just shows how good Cam Asselmont is at writing action scenes. So yeah, there's that. We also need to talk about Tok here, obviously, and the Seti betrayal, or not betrayal, because there's several things going on there. There's several things going on in that whole story of Tok. I'll make Tok's story, all in all, a real tragedy. You have that person who comes into their culture, the Seti culture, as an outsider, kind of goes native without ever, fully getting it, because there's always that he's a secular person. He's not. He can sort of look at the spiritualist side and the shamanistic side, but he doesn't believe that. He talks to the warriors. He probably seriously believes that what he does with the Seti is helping them. It certainly helps him to kind of sort of go native and whatnot. But he fundamentally remains an outsider. And we learn that, and he learns that the hard way once, once Rylanderis returns, Imotan arrives and rises to power, and the Seti leave and then actually kill him. Now, why is that interesting? Why is that important? Because one thing that we learn here is the whole story that we, and like now that we have at least partly entered the age of post-colonialism, something that we need to understand, that how much of a psychic trauma, um, decades or centuries of colonialism, of occupation, of all these other words that are connected, all these other things that are connected to it, can leave, what kind of psychic trauma they can leave with a people. Did the Seti profit from being part of the Malazan Empire? Probably, probably they did, but it also took away a lot of their identity, and that identity, that loss of identity, that loss of individual, cultural heritage and whatnot, that leaves like really deep wounds, and we see all of that come back with Imotan and the people he connects, and they suddenly feel that they have everything back, and now they'll take revenge on the Malazans, because that's sort of what they've always wanted. Because you kind of, like, rightly so, blame your occupiers, your colonial overlords, and whatnot for a lot of terrible things. But that doesn't mean, and this is like what we see afterwards, and or what we'll probably see, and it's already hinted at, there's no going back. This is the sad and terrible truth. Here's, like, first of all, worshipping a monster like Rylanderus may not be a objectively good thing. Just saying. So maybe taking Rylanderus off the board and forcing the Seti to maybe slightly change their cultural ways is not 100% evil. It's one of those things that we need to understand, is like, while respecting all kinds of cultural ideas. And it doesn't, there's a lot of terrible things going on in German tradition that we should also abandon, for example. The point is that cultural parts of a culture are not necessarily objectively valid just by being part of a culture. They need to undergo a different examination. Well, that's a talk for a different, for a different day, I guess. The point here is that times have changed. This is the overall message of this novel, and we'll talk about that on Friday when we wrap it up. But we'll see signs of this here. Times have changed. Going back to worshipping the jackal and being ye olde Seti will no longer really work, because the rest of the world has moved on. Goes the same way for what we see with the Crimson Guard when they show up in Unter. You can no longer be the Crimson Guard of old. In 150 years later, 100 years later, that's not how that will work, because the world has changed. It also goes for Chas and Tok and Urko. They also have trouble, because all of these groups are facing backwards. The Seti are facing backwards. The Wiccans, possibly, we'll learn more about that, I hope, in the near future. The Wiccans are already finding out, but the Seti are looking backwards. The Crimson Guard is looking backwards. The Talian League is looking backwards. The Crimson Guard is looking backwards. Everyone is trying to return to a prior state. That cannot work. History goes one way. Times change. And maybe the Empire is the only entity that understands it. Hopefully Lacine understands it. Possibly Malik Rel understands it. But that's sort of what we face here as well. It's like people trying to return to some imagined glorious past, or holding on to the past, and that will never work. Apart from when you go buy vinyl records because everything was better when it was on vinyl. Please do so. I need to sell them, but that's a different point. Well, that's sort of an important bit here, an important part here. That backwards, the trend backwards. And there's a few people who understand that that's no longer the way. Obviously, the boar, whose name I still can't remember because I'm too lazy to look it up in Night of Knives. But we all know who he is at this point, right? Temper's buddy. And we have the reunion this time round with Temper, Master Sergeant Temp, and that dude deciding to throw in with Nate, Corporal Jumpy, and his kids to attack Rylanderus. But yeah, he has understood. He's trying to, take away the tribal enmities, divest that whole thing. And we see that when they show up, it's like we're here for like a different reckoning, and all these things. What the board, the wild man is trying to do is dissolve all these spiritual aspects, take away the weird religious traditional like overlordship, and it's showed when they show up and they don't have any fetishes or barely any fetishes and whatnot. They are Seti first and foremost. That's sort of what he's trying to achieve here. So he's looking into the future in some way. Will that be successful? Who knows? But at least he's trying and he's understood. And the Empire possibly understands, but apart from that, everyone is trying to go back to the past, and that never works. One thing that I really appreciated is we finally get an explanation, a full-on explanation of why Corbolodam is such a fucking asshole. And it is because of the big legacy that all those other Napans left. Urko, Cartheron, Grinner, Chance, the whole crew that shows up in Deadhouse Landing. And it makes it very, very difficult, or so he claims, to become a Napan of renown, and that's sort of his driving thing, is to just make a name for himself, which is, doesn't make him likable. He's still fundamentally flawed. He's an asshole. He's apparently incompetent, and he's very much, doing things for the wrong reasons, because he's only doing it for reputation and image. But it kind of gets understandable, because if you come from a society where reputation is very, very important, not being able to gain any reputation because you're always overshadowed by your parents, or whatever other large, great persons, if that can really have a severe, terrible impact. I mean, we know that on like the personal levels, like if you're always standing in the shadow of your parents, that can certainly have a terrible impact if you let that whole thing rule yourself. So we finally get that long speech of Corbolodam's. Once again, I don't like the guy either, but it becomes a bit more understandable why he is the dickhead he is. It's still all his fault, because he looks at the world, he has the wrong priorities. But with having those priorities, it's understandable. I guess the point we are missing here is that none of those, like, older generation people ever did it for reputation and fame. Like, Urko is not out to be a famous Napan. He's out to be, mostly a fossil collector, I guess. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that is there. We also see that conversation that I feel is important with Smokey, Greymane, Ogilvy, and Shimmer, when the whole idea that there is something going on, and there's more treachery going on in the Crimson Guard, is brought to Shimmer's attention. We also realize that Shimmer is still not ready to understand that, because Shimmer is honorable, which was her biggest flaw in Path to Ascendancy already. But it's there. Just put a pin in there, and we'll talk about it, I guess, tomorrow or the day after, when we have more Crimson Guardy things going on. The last thing I wanted to talk about today, because I feel I've been blathering on for way too long already, is the end of the Gelal story. Or if it is the end, we will know. Because what we learn here is that once the battle is lost, the Marquis is like, yeah, I'll force marry you, because the line needs to continue and all of that, and she goes away. And this, I feel, is an important aspect. This is a very important aspect of the Malazan world, because it shows something that we have, obviously. And this is important. Not only it's so easy to go, it's like, yeah, but back in medieval times, women were nothing but just breeding machines to keep the family going. It's like, that's bullshit. That specific role of women has remained in the heads of a lot of people all the way up until today. And it's something that we've seen through the entire storyline of Gelal, that she is always just pushed around. She realized that at some point, that she's always just baggage, that like a piece on the board that is moved around by all these guys. And once the Marquis, the last in this line, just decides to make his move, she finally does the thing that she always wanted to do. She just moves. She just goes away. She goes away with Molk, whom she, at the last possible moment, realized is more than or better than she thought. And then he dies, defending her from what I assume are Kenny's Nightblades. So there's that. Which shows us that at least, like, everyone is still so willing to go back to like past stupidity in the whole world, but she moves away and she takes her own life into her own hands, and we'll see what becomes of her. But to have that kind of story line in there for her is part of what makes the Malazan world in general so good, is that it doesn't say everything will be glorious once she goes away. She might just end up as a fisher or whatever, but it's her choice. Like, emphasizing the fact that everyone has a choice over their destiny up to a point, is really important, I feel. And having that her with Gelal is, just good. I just appreciate that. It's something I like. So yeah, that's a lot. I'll be talking to you tomorrow about more of it. And I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, if you still do. And until then, cheers.